Hi, Charlie Walter, and I currently live in Whitney, Texas. I'm the director of Baylor University's Mayborn Museum. I had the opportunity to work here in Fort Worth for 25 years and did a lot of great work with a great group of people. Yeah, I started back in, I think it was 1986 or 87. My first job here was as visitor service manager, and I ran the box office and the ushers and getting people in and out of the Omni Theater. Back in the heyday, it was the only IMAX theater in the whole state of Texas, so we were just swamped, and it was just a great experience, just getting people in and out. But a big part of that job as visitor service manager was how is the IMAX and all the things it does related to the rest of the museum and everything we do. So I was able to bridge a lot of that. Um, so worked my way up, ended up being, I think my first position after being a manager was associate director of interpretation, and it changed to a vice president position. Uh, I was interim director when Don Otto left, and then chief operating officer when Van Romans came. And I think when I left, I was senior vice president of programs or something like that. But anyway, 25 years, lots of great opportunities, and did a lot of great work here. Yeah, it goes back to the DOS Tenanosaur. A young boy walked in the place and had this fossil skull, and Jim Dipley called SMU. We've always been very clear that we're more about teaching and learning than research, but Jim knew very quickly how important this find was. The museum had been in existence 60 or 70 years. By that time, no dinosaur had ever walked in the door in those first 60, 70 years. So Jim called over to SMU because he knew they had a great paleontology group there. And that started a 20, 25-year relationship with SMU, kind of working together. And it just so happened that once Tenanosaur came out and it was a great project, that somebody said, "Oh, I've got a dinosaur on my property. Come excavate it." And it was the Acrocanthosaurus on the Hobson Ranch. And then it seemed like every couple of years something was coming out of the woodwork. And then Lewis Jacobs called one day and said, "We need to go down to the Jones Ranch. Uh, it's a site where Paluxysaurus, at the time it was called Paluxysaurus, was found, but nobody's worked the site for a while." And I was able to introduce myself to a landowner, and he said, "Yeah, I'd be interested in having an excavation." So I remember Jim Diffley, myself, Don Otto, went down with Lewis Jacobs and Dale Winkler. I don't remember if anybody else was there at that time, but you walk on the site of Paluxysaurus, and literally you could just see where there was a dinosaur bone, but it had weathered away and it left an imprint in the limestone there. So you could tell right away that there were fossils that, exposed as well, but not a whole lot. But after looking at that and talking to Bill Jones and DC Jones, they're just very gracious people, and they wanted this animal to come out and be on display for the community. And that began the process right there. Yeah, Mr. Jones always had his puppy dog went with him, and I remember him saying very clearly, "She always walks ahead of me, and that's why she got bit by the rattlesnake last year." But she's okay now, and she's my buddy. Just very gracious. Their farmhouse was 100 years old. It was bought out of a Sears catalog back in the day and built there. DC was always just gracious. And they just open the doors. They just say, "Let us know when you're coming out. We love having you here. We love the fact that these fossils are going to be excavated and put on display." Just very welcoming to the whole crew and what it was all about. Well, we saw that time and time again. The Tyrannosaur docile was a new species, right? The Papasaurus was a new species. We just saw that, and that's what was really cool about this heart of Texas dinosaurs. These were things that weren't in the literature, and that motivated us to really, how do we tell the story now? So I was always very excited to see those research papers coming out of SMU, and the agreement was, we supported the digs, we supported SMU and helped fund the bringing the fossils out of the matrix. SMU did the research, published the papers, but then the fossils came over here, and then SMU helped us interpret them to the public. So it was always a really, really great partnership, and it was not a surprise when they said, oh, it's a new species, because I think at the time, Paluxysaurus was described by a fossil from Maryland. And I was like, okay, well, that's up there. Probably is something different about our species. But then they described it, and they were responsible for the name, and they honored the Jones, so it's Paluxysaurus jonesi. And so we were used to the fact that it was a new species, but then I don't remember how it exactly came up. But we've been talking with Senator Mike Moncrief, who was a senator in town here, a state senator, and we said, we think this is so important. Could we make a resolution to have this be the Texas state dinosaur? He's like, well, yeah, we can do that. So we chatted with him about that. And Senator Moncrief worked it out for us. We went down to Capitol. One of the more interesting things about it was they published that they were going to name the Texas state dinosaur. Well, there was apparently a young 12-year-old boy who came in and said, no, it should be Dimetrodon. And how do you argue with a 12-year-old boy? Well, I turned to Aaron Pan at the time at Curia. I said, Aaron, you're going to have to break his heart and tell him Dimetrodon's not a dinosaur. So Aaron went down there and very graciously explained why this was, this amazing large animal, which was a real dinosaur, was the appropriate one. And while Dimetrodon is super cool, it's a prehistoric reptile. It's not a dinosaur. And so we should honor this as a state dinosaur. And then, now that I work at Baylor, we hosted the American Museum of Natural History's exhibit, The World's Largest Dinosaurs, and they had a pin on the map. And I was like, here it is, there's Paluxysaurus. And I looked down and it said, Sauroposeidon. And I was like, wait a minute, what's this all about? And at some point I saw Lewis Jacobs, Dr. Jacobs, the guy said, what's this Sauroposeidon thing? He goes, oh yeah, somebody thinks it's this, but I think it's going to come back and we'll prove it's really not Sauroposeidon. So, that's science. It comes and goes, and you do your best research and put that out there, and somebody else challenges that. That's science, that challenge and back and forth. But it is fun to just still Google. I still Google Paluxysaurus jonesi. It comes out Texas state dinosaur, and because it was the animal that made those huge trackways, those world famous trackways at Dinosaur Valley State Park that are known globally. There's a trackway in Austin at the Memorial Museum, which has changed its name now to the Texas Museum of Natural History. And then up at the American Museum, those trackways are both places, and still on the site itself, it's just between the trackway and this specimen, it really is a Texas story and a world story. So it's very appropriate that it's Paluxysaurus jonesi. Yeah, and it was Paluxysaurus before that. I mean, so that again, that to me, that's the teachable moment, right? Well, why did that happen? Well, this scientist feels this, and again, all of these arguments are more technical than I'm used to, so I'll let the scientists decide. But I'm glad that we still call it Paluxysaurus jonesi in honor of the Jones family and the Paluxy River. That's that flows through Dinosaur Valley Park. So I think we got it right. Well, I think it was about an 8 or 9 year or 10-year excavation. So, it just kept going. And, but it wasn't really a challenge. It was kind of the joy of what we did. So I know Jim Diffley was the leader, and Jim would work with SMU. And I think they planned like 3 weeks out of the year where they'd go out there and spend concentrated time digging 3 or 4 weeks out of the year. So it was really more joy than challenge. And then probably the biggest challenge, I know we got one bid to articulate Paluxysaurus, and it was in the millions of dollars, and we couldn't afford that. But then we worked with Rob Reed, who'd done some other great work for us, and because he's local and loves dinosaurs and all that, we were able to bring that down. So probably the biggest challenge was the funding to articulate, but the capital campaign that built this building, it was just a little piece of that whole project. So it worked out well. Part of it too is, when we opened, it was in that small dinosaur space. And I'm really glad y'all have moved it out now to be central, because it is. It's a central, very important specimen for the state of Texas. I don't know this for a fact, but I know a lot of museums have casts of dinosaurs, but I'm not sure they have Texas dinosaurs. I still think we have more Texas dinosaurs than any museum in the state. I could be wrong, but real fossils. I think that's important. One of the side stories in this, because dinosaurs are becoming more and more important, and it's because we had that wonderful relationship with Louis Jacobs. We're in a meeting one time just talking about an exhibit. You know, he wrote the book Lone Star Dinosaurs, and he approached us to build a small exhibit that could travel around the state with him as he did his book tours. And we did that. And we did it because it was the right thing to do with a partnership, and because it was getting these dinosaurs that were all new species, again, little fossils here and there, nothing articulated, out and around the state. Well, one of those meetings, we were talking about this small exhibit that was going to travel, and Lewis said, you know, I just got a call from my friend in the Dinosaur Society, and they're working with Spielberg on this new movie called Jurassic Park. And so that relationship with doing real work, doing the real science with real scientists connected us to this bigger story of where all of a sudden the Dinosaur Society was asked to consult on Jurassic Park. And Lewis's comment was, they're going to donate the movie props to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Then they're kind of a mothership for lots of paleontology. And we were like, well, I wonder if they'll travel it. And Lewis says, I don't know. And I said, can you send me information on that? He faxed some handwritten notes and a couple handwritten sketches. That's all there was. And I remember looking at those, and the dinosaurs were so big, they would not fit in our old temporary gallery with our low ceilings. And I remember walking into Don Otto's office, just shaking my head. And Don looks up and goes, what? And I said, Spielberg's going to do dinosaurs. It's going to be called Jurassic Park, based on that Crichton book. And they're going to do an exhibit. I don't think they've thought about traveling it yet. And Don stood up right away, and we started walking around the museum. How can we get this here? How can we do it? Long story short, we were the first museum to sign. They hadn't thought about it traveling, but we were the first museum to sign. But a lot of it was that integrity of working with the real scientists on real projects, and we're in a wonderful market, and you know, our attendance was a lot larger back in the day. IMAX was still driving more and more people our way, but also our exhibit base was growing. So we were a great venue after New York to host Jurassic Park. So the ties on that, you know, doing the real science, those little things that pop up. Number one, you got to listen for it, but you know, listening for it and knowing the potential's there. The other side benefit, or another side story of that, is when Colleen Blair walked in my office and said, "Charlie, I have an idea." I said, "What?" She goes, "It's the Lone Star Dinosaur Field Institute." I said, "Tell me about it." She talked about how she had a vision of creating teachers and having them work in the field, and then going to SMU and then coming to the museum and having it being educational. I just said, "How much do you think that would cost?" She goes, "I could probably do it for $5,000. I said, "Okay, do it." She goes, "You sure?" I go, yeah, do it. We'll find the money. And one of the cool things about that is the teachers would come back together 6 months after the Institute and tell each other how they'd implemented what they learned. And it was like a learning community, and they'd steal ideas from each other. But at one point where we were trying to raise the money for this building, we were in a meeting, Don Otto and I were in a meeting with Val Wilkie, who was head of the Sid Richardson Foundation at the time. I believe that's the right one. And he loves STEM education. And I said, I know we're here to talk about this capital project, but I know how much you really think about science education. Let me show you something. And I took him down to the room, and it was a room where the teachers were sharing their ideas from the summer and how they'd implemented them. And they were wonderful ideas, and they were engaged and really talking positively. And we walked back to the conference room, and Val Wilkie said, "Now, I know we're here to talk about this building, but I also want the proposal for that." And we developed a proposal, and I think it was $60,000 or $80,000 came in for the fund the next 3 years of the Dinosaur Institute. And through that kind of funding, right, we sent teachers home with casts of dinosaur bones, with videotapes produced by Don Garland that were them in the field. They could show their kids that they're actually digging dinosaurs, and then just talking to the researchers. And probably more than anything, you got to sit with Louis Jacobs and Dale Winkler and Jim Diffley, and found out that these are just real people. And they talk about their kids, and they talk about issues. And, oh, yeah, they were world-class scientists as well. but it really broke down a lot of barriers of science. And I just saw that as so positive. So I think we did the Institute maybe 6, 7, 8 years uh, until I really was this building project kind of washed over the museum like a tsunami, and we had to stop a number of things to really focus on getting this building up and done. But then again, yeah, the Paluxysaurus, the threads of what that did for us, and the other big part of that related, because it was real authentic work, we wrote a $1.2 million NSF grant. And NSF was like, oh, yeah. And it wasn't just the exhibit. It was the exhibit along with the Teacher Institute, along with some other things. I can't remember everything we did with it. But we had to produce that exhibit in the old building because the new building didn't get built in the timing we thought it would. And we hosted ASTC or AAM or something. And people loved the exhibit, especially our colleagues, the professionals, because it was very much about taking you through that whole process. So discovering things in the field, going into a lab setting and doing hands-on activities to interpret what you saw in the field. And then at the end, there was a computer where you could, create a world of dinosaurs right here in Texas based on what you learned back there. And then you could send that to your house, and a picture that you did. And then you walked around the corner and there were all the specimens there and all the original Paluxysaurus jonesi. The first time we articulated it, it was literally on just a big wall, two-dimensionally, where we had it painted. I don't know who did the painting. Maybe, I don't think it was Karen Parr on that one. But then we just put the real fossils in the right place. It was just a big skeleton painting. So that was the first iteration of it as we were getting ready to get, raise funds for this building. So yeah, just the ideas that, the authentic work we did, the relationships that we built with both the landowners and the scientific community at SMU, and those relationships are still great to this day. Like at SMU, they come down to the Mayborn Museum at Baylor a couple of times to help me with some things down there, and working on an exhibit with plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, and they're going to help with that as well. So these are great colleagues. But it's because we worked together, and it was definitely a win-win for the museum and for the scientific community. This is my favorite memory. Literally, I was just having a slow day at the office, and I knew Jim and those guys were out camped, and I was like jealous of them being out there. So I walked into Don Otto's office one morning. I said, let's go to the dig site. They've been there all week. Let's just go see it and get out of the office. And Don's like, okay, and we left. We drove down to the dig site. We got there at lunch. And we show up, and they're just breaking for lunch, and they look at us and go, great, you guys show up for lunch. We're doing all the work, and you show up for lunch. We're like, well, yeah, we're directors and assistant directors. That's what we do. So, yeah, we had that kind of great relationship. So we went and had lunch with them. We came back, and the crew started digging in one part of the quarry. And Lewis Jacobs and I were standing right there, and Don Otto. And I said, well, Lewis, why isn't anybody digging over here? And he goes, well, Charlie, you can dig here if you want. And I literally looked down. There was a rock. And I looked down, and I shook the rock, and I pulled the rock up, and below it was a beautiful brown sheen of dinosaur bone. And I said, look, Lewis, it's right there. And he just shook his head and walked off. And within 5 minutes, everybody who'd been digging over there for 4.5 days, hadn't found anything. They were here, and it ended up being a 4 or 5 foot humerus of this animal, really literally under this much sand. It was right there, and it just was laid out perfectly. The bottom of it was in a matrix, but the top was just like it was laying in the sand. And they'd actually been driving an excavator over that to get over this other area to remove some overburden. So whenever I come here with students from Baylor, we walk by the specimen, I'm like, see that bone right there? I found it. So I am very proud of that. And it was fun. It was just fun. The way you couldn't have set it up any better. It's like, why isn't anybody digging here? Well, you can dig here. See, it's right there. So yeah, that's the joy of it. And of course, right, this work and the joy of discovery led to Dino Dig. And Dino Dig in the old building, 15 years after we opened it, students are in the hallway chanting, Dino Dig. I tell people it's better than buried treasure. They're digging for dinosaur bones. So we created Dino Dig, and we salted it with fossils, and it's so fun to see a little kid, having a little fossil that they took out of here that they discovered. And I had parents come up to me with buckets of fossils while I worked here, and they said, "Well, my son found one. He was so excited. We went to a ranch we know, and we collected all these fossils. We want to give them to you to bury them for other kids to find." And again, it's just that joy of authentic discovery and this the reality of it. And Dino Dig still is probably one of the more creative things we did. And I give Colleen Blair and Kit Goolsby credit because we were doing some strategic planning, and we sent teams out to different parts of the country of people we knew were doing good work to steal ideas and bring them back and talk about them. And when I say steal, the museum community is very caring and giving. It's not stealing, you're sharing. But they came back, and there was a park in Columbus where they had a welded dinosaur skeleton. It was all metal. He had kind of a sauropod. He had a big smiley face, and this dump truck just come and piled sand on him. And the kid just spent all day uncovering it. And we went, and it was done in a very playground way. And we were like, what if we did it in an authentic way? Mm-hmm. And that's how Dino Dig came about. And every bone in there was a cast from a real specimen that was made out of some kind of heavy concrete that wouldn't, for the most part, kids couldn't do. We created a stream that went through it, and we put Tyrannosaurus and the big Acrocanthosaurus out there. And that was just a wonderful project, working with people of the Larson Company out of Tucson to make that happen. We had done some homework and found that they had done some dinosaur parks. We thought they'd be the best to work with, and they were. They were wonderful to work with. The project manager on that was Dan Cole. Dan ultimately was hired by the Pro to come manage all their exhibits when they opened. So just again, good solid person, good work, and just a really good project. Well, scientifically, it was important work. It starts there, right? This was real science, real work. And if you look at Louis Jacobs' book, Lone Star Dinosaurs, the middle chapter, Heart of Texas Dinosaurs, it's all about this work. So we added a chapter through that partnership, added a chapter to that scientific research. And then beyond that, it's the fact of what the museum stood for. The museum stood for real science, interpreting that science with the community, but then creatively finding ways to do it with features and Lone Star Dinosaurs and Dino Dig, and then you bring in Jurassic Park. So we leveraged that authentic work, then found ways to engage different audiences, but it was all based on that real work. The integrity of it was really solid. And actually, when we hosted Jurassic Park, New York would not let any of their fossils travel. So we found fossils from colleagues in museums across the country. I know there were some that came in from Utah. My favorite part was all the little all the little fossil remnants that we put in. There were little pieces of what we had excavated here in Dallas, in Fort Worth, and West. And then we asked Karen Carr to paint dinosaurs for us. She had never painted dinosaurs before. So Karen painted all the dinosaurs, and those ended up in Lewis's book along with others. And then we purchased that collection when the book was published. And Karen basically gave them to us at a very, very low price because she respected the science and the project and the partnership so much. And Karen's gone on to be an international artist, so still a wonderful friend. So again, another spin-off story that comes right back to the work, the real work of it all. So yeah, even though we didn't have PhD researchers on staff, we had interpreters like Jim Diffley and Bill Loss, who were men of science, people of science, but they respected the science enough to know, you know what, we need to find the right partner to do this the right way. And, when it's authentic and it comes from your own passion, that's where all these things build from there. And I think that's why it was so successful. I think that's why we received a large NSF grant. It was real science, real work, and it's easier to get kids excited about science when it's in their backyard. And this was literally in their backyard. And I remember, I can't remember exactly where we were, but whenever you get a big NSF grant, it's a happy day. And so receiving that grant again was a stamp of approval that the science is important, the way we're approaching it educationally is important, and this exhibit that's coming out of it is important. Now, we had to take the exhibit down when we built this building, and the space allocated in this building wasn't enough to do what we had done in the old building. So it's just a little vignette here now, what we had then, but that's exhibits, right? Exhibits come and exhibits go. But I think the work we did, and because of the NSF funding, we were able to get Randy Korn involved to do a summative evaluation. I have that in your files, just talking about how the exhibit connected with people. And because, back, again, we're talking back in 2005, maybe, the fact that we allowed people to do something here and then send it back to their own home via the internet, that was a big deal back then. It wasn't happening a lot. So, we had some cutting edge technology. It was based on the real science, but it was very much about the process of scientific inquiry. It was, I'm in this spot. I see a lot of bones. How do I make sense of this? And I remember we had at least 3 interpretive strategies to connect visitors to that dig area. And it worked. They were engaged, and then they took what they knew over to the lab area to interpret what they'd seen out in the dig area. Ultimately, they created a world with dinosaurs that was their belief based on everything they had done. So, and then they walk around the corner and see the real thing. Like, oh, this isn't make up. This isn't make believe. This isn't science coming over from China. No, this is Parker County, Somerville County, Tarrant County. So it really connected, I think, well with audiences. You gotta, people that have the passion for it find a way. That's the bottom line. People who have a passion for the science, they get involved with it. They may study it in college. You may end up having your whole life. You may end up being a volunteer because you can't find a way to support your family through some of this stuff, and paleontology positions are few and far between. But frankly, volunteer paleontologists make the biggest discovery, or most of the discoveries, right? Dallas Paleontological Society does amazing work with people who volunteer because they love it. I was literally talking with someone yesterday who had brought in some Native American artifacts. And he's like, oh, I don't know anything about this, but I just love it. I said, you're an informal educator. You've got that passion, and you've got the spark, and you've got that enthusiasm, and then just follow your spark, follow it and go. So yeah, you don't know if you'll be able to make a career out of it. I mean, my undergraduate work was in wildlife science. I thought I really wanted to be more in the science department, but then I decided, I got to support my family. So I got an MBA. I decided I needed to run the place one day, and eventually I did. But I think the reason I've been relatively successful is I have a passion from the wildlife science museum studies degree from A&M that kind of fuel, that's the fuel that lets everything else go. So, now I'm a director and I'm having to raise money, but I'm raising money for the best things, right? I'm, raising money for education and exhibits, and literally to this day, just the creativity and the opportunity to put together an exhibition. And then you see how it connects with people, and when people are engaged and they're learning in there, it makes it all worthwhile. I approach everything collaboratively, and I learned that through this project. When I went down and became director of the Mayborn Museum at Baylor, within a month before I arrived, and the museum staff had been working on this for a while. A month before I arrived, the National Park Service said yes, they would make a national monument out of a research site, which is just like the Jones Ranch site. But this one happens to have mammoths down in Waco. Well, it started at the museum. We excavated it for years, but again, before my time, the people reached out to the community. The community ended up putting a dig shelter over it because it just seemed like such a great spot for education and research. And then eventually, because it was done at such a high quality level, the National Park Service said, yeah, we can work with you on this. So, being at Waco now, the Mayborn has been working that site for 40 years. The city got involved 15 years well, 25 years after we started, the city got involved. And then 10 years after the city got involved, the National Park Service got involved. But and there's also a private foundation now that helped raise money for the dig site. So still that collaborative work and working collaboratively is still that best model, in my opinion, as opposed to the lone scientist who's out there doing their own thing and, then they come back and put it in a shelf and that's it. No, doing it as a group, doing it together, banding your strengths together. So really that's one of my number one lessons, and it goes back to Don Otto, being a collaborative partner. Don got us involved with the Science Museum Exhibit Collaborative. The Exploratorium Exhibit Partnership was a Don Otto. I brought up the idea of the Youth Museum Exhibit Collaborative. It's like, let's do it. And then the PI Network came on board, Playful Invention Network. So through collaboration, we've made partners all over the country, and we brought all that learning here to the museum. And it really created just such a rich, dynamic environment, and really helped the museum learn and grow. And I think if you're constantly trying something new, bringing in a new partner to try something new, it just keeps a place really fresh and dynamic. And so the collaborative nature of the dinosaur work, I think, followed through with lots of other things we did. You know what? I never personally met him, but Jim Diffley came up and told me that he had met him, and Dr. Langston said the mammoth skull at Fort Worth Museum of Science and History was the spark that got him involved in paleontology. Yeah. And I said, Jim, we need this story on videotape, and I know it's in the archives now. But just the idea that this young kid was walking around this skull when it was in the Carnegie Library before this museum was here, and I think it's still artifact number 1, came over here. So this young boy is walking around that skull, and the librarian's like, kid, go do something. What are you doing here? He's like, no, where did this come from? How did you get it? And, do you have any books on fossils? And they went and looked. They did not have a book on the fossils in Fort Worth Public Library. But the librarian was wonderful enough to take him into the office, and they called a bookstore, and they found a book on fossils. So when Juan Langston, the young boy, left, he talked to his parents about this. They went to that bookstore, bought him that book. So I know in our archives there's a picture of him in front of that fossil, the mammoth skull, holding that book. And so that was his spark, and that's what led him in that way. And I think, when there's so much science in front of you, you've got to prioritize. And I think they opened up that site and just took the stuff that was readily there. They really didn't excavate it very deeply. And from what was there, they found enough to do their research and publish papers. And that was enough. But they were researchers, then we come along and like, well, we're museum people. We want that specimen on display. We want as much of this as we can get. So again, that's the partnership coming on board that helps us really work together to excavate it in the right way, supervised by the paleontologists. I was amazed when I heard that too. It had been discovered way back then, reopened again, but still, probably that animal has 20 to 30% real fossils there, and there's more in the collection, I know. That was just sitting there. It hadn't been fully excavated. So I think it's a function of how much time and energy it takes, and then what are other priorities. Well, when we saw it, we knew it was just such a huge opportunity, and the community supported us. The foundation supported us through our teacher work. And we were able to just spend the time it took. Yeah, it sounds right. And again, the good thing is the integrity of the science of it is we fully respect everything they did at UT and what they're all about. And I know they helped inform our exhibit and our program. And I wouldn't doubt Jim talked to Dr. Langston about the project itself. So that's a good Jim question. Because he did meet Dr. Langston, and it just tickled me to death when I heard that story. Again, you never know when a kid's going to stand in front of Paluxysaurus, and that's going to be their spark to start them on that career path. And again, you can stick with it, follow it through, or life turns you another way, but you still have that passion. It doesn't mean you can't still go to museums, you can't volunteer with Dallas Paleo Society, people like that. You can always go out and fossil hunt on your own, right? When I left here, I went to New Mexico. The New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science, they were started by the state. So there was a state law created to create the museum and give it the mandate to preserve the natural history of New Mexico. And that was awesome to have that mandate. But my paleontologists out there said, acre for acre, New Mexico has some of the richest dinosaur finds in the world. And so it was wonderful to step off from here, and the experiences I had here, led me right over to New Mexico, where we were doing the same thing. And, I think I was involved with at least 3 press releases of new species where the media would come in and talk about new species that we had found there. And we had an incredible group of volunteers that both were on the field excavating, but also volunteers in the fossil prep labs and doing stuff. So there's lots of opportunities to plug into this type of work, even if they're not getting paid for it as a professional. And I think there are very few people who are paid for it as a profession. So, and even someone like Jim Dipley, right? Jim had tons of other things on his plate here at the museum. He gave lectures in museum school. We were building other exhibits. We were building national traveling exhibits. And so, it's just, you fit it in the best you can. And he did a great job of prioritizing it and getting it organized. I think Jim was like the backbone that held that whole process together over that 10 or 20 years. And it was really wonderful because Jim had left the museum when it began to articulate it at Rob Reed's studio, and Rob brought Jim on as a staff member to help make that happen. So Jim's probably one of the very few people who pulled it out of the ground, helped with research on it, and then got to articulate it and put it back on display. That's pretty few and far between, I'm sure. To me, one of the important aspects of the work we did back then was that a lot of it's still in your collection. So when are you going to articulate Acrocanthosaurus? It needs to be articulated. There's no other Texas specimen, period. I think there's a cast from an Oklahoma specimen at the Perot and at the Whitty, but this is the Texas specimen, and it deserves to be articulated and put on display. So what else is in the collection? What other ways can we interpret it? There's been new science. How do we address Sauroposeidon versus Paluxysaurus? That conversation is a great opportunity to teach people about science in general. So I still think there's lots of ripples left from that work. It's interesting. I don't think since Paluxysaurus was excavated that any other dinosaurs have walked in the door. I mean, there was that 20-year renaissance that really was amazing. I'm really feel proud and honored to be part of that. But there are still more dinosaurs out there. We know that. I was on a ranch west of Waco, and there's a dinosaur trackway, and the landowner's like, I don't want it just to weather away. And I'm like, would you consider donating it to the Mayborn Museum? He's like, well, I'd consider that. So there's still opportunities out there for this type of work. The more that you and the museum can talk about the dinosaur work, projects like this, the more people will know that the museum, has always been very serious about this and will do work in the right way. And hopefully another kid will walk in the door one day with a little fossil they found, and somebody will say, that looks pretty good. Let's call our colleagues at SMU again, get them over here. And maybe that would be my hope, that there's more dinosaurs in your future. And I think that's important to keep the museum alive and breathing and growing, because you're doing authentic science and you're bringing it here then to educate people around that science. And it's a thrill of discovery. It's awe-inspiring when you see it out there in the rotunda. It really keeps the museum genuine, real, alive. You're doing the real work of science. And again, you don't have to have all the scientists on staff. It's through those partnerships that can keep that moving in the right direction. So that's what my hope is, that you guys have another dinosaur that walks in the door, and then you can begin that work, collaborative work again, because it does just build community momentum around what you do and excitement around what you do, because it is exciting. I think if you had I don't know the real number, right? You have 10 kids, 5 boys and 5 girls, and you say, you want to dig up dinosaur bones or buried treasure? My bias says 8 out of the 10 would say dinosaur bones. That's just the way I feel about it. And that's why I think this work's very exciting. This has claws and teeth. It's wonderful. And it was big. Well, that's the other cool part, right? Some of these things weren't big. The little Paluxysaurus skeleton y'all have, and those little Hypsilophodons, that's another whole layer of the story. So anyway, Fort Worth Museum of Science and History has important chapters in the Texas dinosaur story. And I think those chapters are every bit as important as what Dr. Langston did down in Austin. And I hope as y'all grow and move into the future, you're able to, tell those stories in bigger, better ways here at the museum to keep the stories in front of people, but also just to give the stories the time and space they deserve. Because I know, again, when you open a big museum like this, you're trying to juggle 12 balls in the air at one time, and you do your best. But then, then you follow up and say, okay, what's next? And I think just moving the Paluxysaurus front and center the way you did, that's huge. And that's, showing it as an icon of what we do and what we've done here in the past. So more things like that would be wonderful. Yeah, it just brings it to life, right? You're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Just coming here, right? I pulled up some old files. I found the old files from the Rob Reed studio. I found the file that one of our staff did, just photos of the interim exhibit that was on site before the old building got torn down. So there's photos of that, and I'm sure there's great photos here as well. But it's part of who we are. It's part of the history of this place, and a lot of museums don't have that kind of real, authentic history. To really have those relationships with the landowners we had, and with the scientific community at SMU and beyond, because scientists came down from Oklahoma. I think Denver Museum came down. People knew this was real work, and that was the great thing about working with the National Science Foundation, right? They funded national level projects. So to make it a national level project, you have experts who have passion for the work. And so I think it was Dr. Richard Stuckey, Jim Diffley, I know the real names, from Denver. He came down. Somebody came down from Oklahoma. Of course, Louis Jacobs and Dale Winkler. So just having these people sit around the table, they were excited about it. This is legit, real work. And then we had, because of the NSF funding, we had people like Judy Rand and Randy Korn. And if you look at museum literature, they're top professionals in the field. They came down to be part of the project because it was such an important project. But again, because we got it funded in the right way, we were able to put it together in that right way. So that was, I really feel good about the way we approached it. We also worked with a group called Hands On Inc. out of St. Petersburg. They did a wonderful job helping us think through how to approach this, and did all the design work, and actually did most of the fabrication work of what we built here. So again, bringing on a national group that did stellar work, just, it was all about the quality of what we're doing. We pulled together the best people in the country to get it done. And that was the plan all along, right? And that's one of the reasons NSF funded it, is because it was a national level project telling a local story, but the implications were national. Educationally, it would be significant, but the science was real science, and the science was significant. And because of the players we brought around the table, NSF said, yeah, this is worthy of national support. We were fortunate over about a 15-year period. I think we brought in, it was over $8 million from the National Science Foundation. but it was because of the real work we were doing, both from the standpoint of science, but also education. We were really connected to great partnerships through Donato. We nurtured those partnerships because we knew we had a lot to learn. And I think that's why we were always a good partner, because we never stepped into a partnership saying, you're lucky to have us as a partner. No, we always felt lucky to be a partner and just would bring all that learning back into the building here. And then literally, when we got our first national grant, it was the biggest federal grant, probably the only first federal grant we ever got. And it was a matter of, okay, we're funded on a national level. What are the national dialogues that are out there? Now, we need to be aware of those, because if we want national funding, we need to be aware of what's going on nationally and how we can support those national initiatives and ideas. We shifted our thinking through all of this work, partnered with some of the biggest museums in the country, and then again, we're able to bring all that talent back to Fort Worth. It's the idea from a management standpoint. We call it what's called a network organization. That's what it's called. It's like you have partners all across the country, and it becomes your job to also help them be successful. That's why it's a successful network. But then they help you be successful. So, the credit doesn't go under this one roof. It's under SMU's roof. It's under, the other museum colleagues that came in to help us. It's Hands-On Inc. out of St. Petersburg came in. So all those things were important. And that's what elevated us as professionals and elevated our work here. And the museum was known across the country for that level of work. And the dinosaurs were always a big part of that.